Yep, right there. See better than I can. I can.
I can straight. Yep. Somebody's gonna sit straight.
Peace. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the forum. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, and I'm so pleased that so many of you could be here tonight as we recognize and celebrate the 25th anniversary of Robert Kennedy's announcement for the presidency in 1968. A dozen of these celebrations and ceremonies are being held and have been held around the country at universities, and we're very pleased that at this place the memory of the founder of the Institute of Politics and really the primary creator of the Kennedy School as we know it, Robert Kennedy, can be also honored here. To begin the evening, let me ask Carrie Kennedy Cuomo to introduce a short film and to get us started. She is the executive director and founder of the RFK Memorial Center for Human Rights, a writer who serves on numerous boards and commissions and various civic activities. The center is hosting, as I said, more than a dozen of these celebrations around the country, and we're just very pleased that we could be part of that. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Kennedy Cuomo.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for joining us to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Robert Kennedy's entrance into the presidential campaign. I think this is a time for all of us to think about what Robert Kennedy meant to us as Americans, for his family and friends, as a friend, and for me personally as my father. A lot of people ask me what Daddy was like, and it's hard to describe him briefly, but because he was a complex man and also because he was my father. But I remember one story. One memory stands out in particular. When I was a kid, my father was away a lot, and one time he was away and all of us I had 10 brothers and sisters, we were all sitting around the dinner table and sort of screaming and crying and yelling at each other about passing the milk, and all of a sudden the door opened and my father was standing there, and there was dead silence in the room, and he said, "I've just been to a part of the country where 3 families live in a shack the size of this room. And I want you to do something to help those children. Please help those children." And he repeated it a 3rd time, "You've got to help those children." I think that story is important to me because it was important to him, and also because I think it shows his compassion for those who suffer, his faith that we can, in fact, change things, and the urgency with which he urged us to try and change things. Since my father's death, many people have described to me similar encounters with Robert Kennedy which changed their lives. At least 4 of the 7 Democratic presidential candidates in the 1988 campaign have said that Robert Kennedy inspired them to enter politics. I have heard like accounts hundreds of times in my travels around this country. Democrats, Republicans, and independents express the same sentiment. Bill Clinton, our new young president, called Robert Kennedy one of his principal political heroes. The phenomenon is so widespread that one political analyst recently called the current crop of U.S. political leaders Kennedy's children, because many of them began their political careers in an effort to retrieve the torch that was dropped after President Kennedy's and my father's assassinations. Robert Kennedy championed the disenfranchised from Watts to the Mississippi Delta. He battled corrupt union bosses and protected Alabama freedom riders. He marched with Cesar Chavez and opposed the Vietnam War. He soothed those who suffered, and he suffered himself. He fought racism, lauded courage, and called for peace. Although he had passion, he was not a sentimentalist. There was laughter and joy at our dinner table, but also discipline. Each night, my father expected us to relate and be prepared to discuss a current event at the table. Sundays, we memorized a poem or a biographical sketch. He felt that we would be ineffective in life if we lacked the facts and the ability to marshal and employ them. For this, we needed self-control and preparation. Although Robert Kennedy is no longer with us, the commitment he made with his life and with his death is carried forward by many whose lives he touched. They are indeed a diverse group. They range from farm workers to journalists to miners to ambassadors to heads of state to school children to his own family. Each of us has our own memories of Robert Kennedy, and you will hear many of them tonight, I'm sure. But there are many common threads. He fought for the dispossessed, the underdog, and he saw strength in the unity rather than the division of disparate groups. He respected courage, and he had the courage to grow and learn. He believed that change was good, not just for society at large, but for he himself as well. He had a raw and disturbing honesty. He made us strive to be better than we ourselves believed we could. And millions of Americans and people around the world shared with us, his family, an unbearable sense of loss when he died. Why, a quarter of a century after his death, does his memory continue to hold our generation? Perhaps because so many of the challenges Robert Kennedy addressed 25 years ago are central to the American agenda today. 25 years ago, race riots exploded across the nation from Washington to Watts. Robert Kennedy condemned the violence and called for faith in the rule of law. He demanded jobs and opportunity for the city and asked for compassion and understanding between blacks and whites. Today, we wait with bated breath for the outcome of the second Rodney King trial and brace ourselves for the reaction to the verdict. We have yet to cross the racial divide. 25 years ago, Robert Kennedy brought his presidential campaign to the areas of suffering in America, to Appalachia, to the Mississippi Delta, to Delano with Cesar Chavez, to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, to Bed-Stuy. Today, 25 years later, a quarter of a century later, you can go to any of those parts of our country and you will see that same suffering. Economics and social justice remains a dream deferred. So 25 years is not such a long time. And I believe his memory holds us because people identified with his unique mixture of passion and pragmatism, which complemented rather than contained each other. He allocated his energies to the achievable and useful, but his passion gave him a broader vision. He could see things that others considered unachievable and ask, why not? This mixture of passion and pragmatism marked his public life, and nothing illustrates this characteristic better than his devotion to the democratic system. My father loved democracy. He loved the ancient Greeks because they invented democracy, and he shared their contempt for those who refused to participate in the political process. He believed that we face almost insurmountable problems as a nation and a planet, and that the only system that could hope to cope with these problems is democracy. Democracy, he believed, is the only system that can harness the energies of all the diverse people. He understood that while democracy creates inefficiencies that are expensive for society, the alternatives in the long term are much more expensive and deadly. At least in part because of his efforts to guarantee a franchise to black citizens, constitutional democracy was realized in the United States for the first time in our history during his lifetime. His intellectual devotion to democracy supported his visceral passion for justice. He knew that the democratic system was the creation of idealists, and so it would take enormous discipline to make such a system work. He believed that the rule of law holds a democratic society together and that justice delayed is democracy denied. He quoted what Montesquieu wrote in 1748, that God created all men equal, but society, in its natural course, will rob them of their equality, which they can recover only by protection of the law. Although he fought to protect the Alabama Freedom Riders, he favored judicial action to advance voting rights over civil disobedience because he believed that the democratic process would kill Jim Crow more effectively. He fought to include the disenfranchised because he saw that the democratic engine could not function without the participation of all its parts. He had the sense of the fragility of the democratic system, which, to our great jeopardy, some have lost today. He saw politics as the profession that makes this animated and fragile system live. The leaders we entrust with this momentous task have to seek a nobility that the rest of us must count on. Their offices and services shall enrich society and advance its interests rather than enrich themselves. If democracy is to function, a high percentage of those who hold public office must be honorable and courageous people, and politics must be an honorable profession. So this conference series is, in part, for our political leadership to inspire, enrich, and validate their efforts and their ideals. But the most important message in my father's life is that we can't just count on our leaders. All of us must work to make our system function and function fairly. Democracy summons leaders at every level of the community. Robert Kennedy's is an appeal to the spirit, demanding that we engage ourselves in making the world or some part of it a better place to live. I've heard Latinos and blacks and Native Americans and blue-collar workers and professionals say that when Robert Kennedy died, so did their hope. I am moved by their high regard and affection that people feel for him a quarter of a century after his death, but still I am distressed by their sentiment, and he would be too. To those who are tempted to give up or retreat into cynicism, I would repeat what my father said to us, his band of 10 at home, and to thousands across our great country. Let no one be discouraged by the belief that there is nothing one man can do about the enormous array of the world's ills, about misery and ignorance, injustice and violence. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And in the total of all these acts will be written the history of this generation. This is a time when the mantle of leadership is being passed to a new generation, when young people can make a difference. It is a time, once again, to make politics an honorable profession. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Charles Guggenheim's film, Robert F. Kennedy Remembered.
No man had ever dedicated his life more to the life of another than Robert Kennedy had for his brother. They had shared the journey to power and the successes and disappointments of leadership, but they were very different.
I think he had one time around, I'm impatient. You know, there was somebody wrote on the pyramids, time they were being constructed, the words, and no one was angry enough to speak out. I think people should be angry enough to speak out. I think there are injustices, and I think there are unfairnesses in my own country and around the world, and I think that if one feels it involved in it, that one should try to do something about it.
Towards the dispossessed and the powerless, he felt a special concern, and he brought to them a touch of hope. The more he saw of this America, the more he would ask, what of their future? Starved in mind and body, they had been damaged beyond compare. He saw in America an island of poverty in a sea of affluence.
Hasta Sacramento.
When freedom's sons were on the march, it was his march. He was with Cesar Chavez to protest the suffering of migrant farm workers. He was there to share the breaking of the fast and the benediction of a cause that could not wait. In this war in Vietnam, he shared the responsibility, but now he spoke against it, not in anger, but in deepening sorrow. Why, he asked, should the black and the poor bear an unequal burden of sacrifice there? Can we ordain ourselves to the awful majesty of God to decide who is to live and who is to die? Concerned that we were destroying a people and creating a wasteland, he called for a reevaluation of principles.
We have the capacity to make this the best generation in the history of mankind or make it the last. President Kennedy's favorite quote was really from Dante, that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in time of moral crisis preserve their neutrality. So if all of us, whether it's in the field of civil rights or housing or whether it's in Vietnam or whatever it is, just hang back and say this is a problem of somebody else, then we're going to be in difficulty. Even if we look at this selfishly, we're going to be in difficulty. The whole system's going to be in difficulty. I think that for all of us, that we have an obligation. And we have a special, not only responsibility, but a special opportunity to make a difference in the world and make a difference for this country.
In 1968, he made the most important political decision in his life, to seek the presidency, to seek new policies, to close the gaps.
We cannot separate ourselves, no matter where we live, from the problems and the troubles and the difficulties that face the whole of the United States. I don't think it's tolerable that young men and young women growing up in our great cities are not able to find jobs. I don't think it's tolerable here in this country that a young boy or a young girl, even when they finish school, are illiterate and uneducated, and therefore can't go on to either a college or university or on to an employment. And I think whites and blacks, poor and rich together, that we can work together. Jefferson once said about the United States, we were the last best hope of mankind. That's what I want the United States to be. This is a generous and compassionate country. That's what I want this country to stand for. Not violence, not lawlessness, not disorder, but compassion and love and peace. That's what this country should stand for, and that's what I intend to do if I'm elected president.
I had a hammer in the morning, I had a hammer in the evening, all over this land. I had a hammer out danger, I had a hammer out of warning, I had a hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Oh, well, I got a hammer and I got a bell and I got a song to sing all over this land. It's a hammer of justice, it's a bell of freedom, it's a song about love between the brothers and the sisters all over this land. It's a hammer of justice, it's a bell of freedom, it's a song about love between the brothers and the sisters all over this land.
Somewhere over Indiana, on the evening of April 4th, 1968, he was informed that Martin Luther King had been shot. Again, the bullet. Again, the agony.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people.
The prayer he asked for America would not be answered in his lifetime. Perhaps for his children, but not for him.
My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. To be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Those of us who loved him pray that what he was to us and what he wished for others will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?
Who are here today, my brother Michael, my sister-in-law Vicki Kennedy, and my cousin Stevie Smith. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And now, when Robert Kennedy's brother died, he wanted to create a living memorial to him. And he turned to one person to help him do that. And that's our next speaker, Richard Neustadt, and I'd like you to help me in welcoming him, the creator and the first director of the Institute for Politics, Richard Neustadt.
Thanks. I won't be long, but there are a couple of things I want you to do. Take a large look around the room. Look at the room. Then look down the hall where the Institute of Politics is. The Institute is a non-credit organization run by the Kennedy School for the benefit of undergraduates, and it's right across the street from the Harvard River houses. And I want you to look at up there, and you've got corridors going off in all directions and classrooms on all sides. And that's the curricular part of the school. And all of this exists because of Bob Kennedy's decisions, nobody else's. He and his family had wanted to create some form of living memorial to the president, John F. Kennedy, after his death. In addition to the library was to be federally managed, and it was to be an archive and a museum. And the then directors of the National Archives said that's all they could be responsible for. They couldn't do anything else. That seemed very unsatisfying to members of the family and their friends. They wanted something that would engage young people. And since the library was to be located originally by the president's choice across the river at the business school, they thought the best thing they could do was create some kind of educational institution in conjunction with the library, privately funded and managed, which would somehow be of use to students. At that point, the president of Harvard went to Bob Kennedy, who was the executor of the president's estate and was head of the private corporation that was going to raise funds for the library. President Pusey of Harvard went to Bob Kennedy and proposed that the institute, whatever it was to be, since it was to deal with young people, be made part of Harvard. Be placed in what was then the Graduate School of Public Administration, a school with no faculty, 100 mid-career students. It was sort of an administrative device to house those students who took courses around the university. This institute, an institute of and for politics, would be brought into the school. The school would be endowed by $10 million from the Kennedy Library Corporation, in return for which Harvard would change the school's name to the Kennedy School. Bob thought about this quite hard and consulted quite widely about it. He was, as always when I saw him, thoughtful, concerned to get the maximum amount of information, free with his questions, insisted on getting answers, and then he thought, and then he decided. And when he decided. He was a very decisive decider. So he decided to accept President Pusey's offer. Then I was asked to come to Harvard and be the first director of this institute within the school. And I once noticed two things. You couldn't have an institute of politics and a school of public administration. So I suggested you had to change the name. Bob decided that was a good idea and persuaded the president of Harvard it was a good idea. That was done. Then I was told by everyone, including Ken Galbraith, that Harvard students, undergraduates, never crossed the river. It was unthinkable that they would go do anything over there. So we came to the conclusion that the site would have to be moved. There was here a car barn, so-called, for the subway system. Turned its trains around and did some light machine work on them. Nate Pusey had wanted this site for 20 years. No chance to get it. But when it was pointed out to Bob that the river would be a barrier between students and the library, he decided it would be a good idea to go after this site. And the Kennedy family's persuasion, the legislature of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts directed the MBTA to relinquish the site for a very moderate sum. The original intention had been, and it was a great idea, to build not only this school, but adjacent to it, the library with its archive and museum, and adjacent on the other side, the Centers for International Affairs and the Arts and Sciences Departments of Economics and Government, creating a great, large, integrated set of related institutions here, all of them surrounding the archive and museum, to which hundreds of thousands of visitors, it was hoped, would come. Bob saw in this, among other things, a wonderful chastening corrective for the Kennedy School and its Institute of Politics. With voters, serried ranks of voters, hundreds of thousands of voters every year going by the windows and looking in. it was a great idea. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because after his death, the well-to-do neighborhood up here started agitating against the notion that all the hoi polloi would trek their way through this part of Cambridge. And with threats of suits and environmental impact studies and so forth, managed to delay things so long that, quite reasonably, the family decided to separate the projects and build the archive and museum elsewhere. But what you see here, and where you see it here, is entirely due to Bob Kennedy's decisions. Other people recommended, he decided. Whether he would have liked what he now sees here is a question. The school, it seems to me, I haven't counted lately, but I keep looking around me, its senior faculty now seems to have a preponderance of economists, a great number of whom regard politics as an externality. You can imagine what Bob Kennedy would have thought of that. He would have been proud of the 5, I think it is, members of Congress who were once students in this school. He'd have wanted to know why it was 5 and not 50, a good question to which we do not have a good answer. He would have been delighted with the Institute of Politics and the work it does with undergraduates. But he'd have wanted to know why so many of them had ended in other walks of life than the political. Because what Carey said is exactly right. He thought of politics as a noble calling. He thought of it as the quintessentially important calling to make things happen and make things better. And I'm afraid I have to say he'd have been dissatisfied with all of us in the attention we have paid that calling in the years since his death. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick, very much. I can say he wouldn't be dissatisfied with you, I think. We are going to talk about politics tonight, and we're going to talk about it not in memoriam. We're going to talk about it as it lives and breathes and is and hopefully can be through the perceptions and the experience of people who go back in some cases to that 1968 campaign, some who go back to campaigns, at least one who goes back to campaigns beyond that, and others who exemplify the political spirit and commitment that Robert F. Kennedy exemplified in his life. And it's not going to be a retrospective, but it's going to be a set of perspectives on what we need to do to reconnect with the excitement and the mother lode of civic involvement and energy that we have been talking about here tonight. We begin with very brief introductions of the panelists, and I'll ask each of them to very briefly try to achieve some of those broad goals I've laid out for them, although I hesitate to lay out any goals for John Kenneth Galbraith, Professor of Economics Emeritus, who needs no further introduction, except that his rich political background goes back to FDR, ambassador to India under President Kennedy, worked in every campaign up until the last one that occurred in his neighborhood. Paul Kirk, who was treasurer and then for 4 years chair of the Democratic Party, also worked in the 1968 Kennedy campaign He's the chairman of the board and of directors of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and he has experience in the Senate Judiciary Committee and was special assistant to Senator Ted Kennedy. Mark Shields is a former Institute of Politics fellow who also worked in the 1968 campaign and wrote a wonderful piece in the Washington Post on Monday about 25 St. Patrick's Days ago when Robert Kennedy went out and campaigned in his unique way. He's best known to all of us, I think, for his regular political analysis with David Gergen, another IOP fellow, on the McNeil-Lehrer report, and his regular appearances on CNN with the Capital Gang. Next to Mark Shields is Reverend Charles Stith, who's founder of the Organization for a New Equality, which is a national organization aimed at providing equal opportunity for women and people of color, equal economic opportunity. He teaches at the Divinity School, taught a study group here at the Institute of Politics, and is involved in lots of community activities. Senator Diane Wilkerson was a study group teacher at the Institute of Politics last year, and during that period of time she was elected to the state Senate, becoming the first African-American woman to achieve that in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Which we think Bobby Kennedy would have looked on very approvingly. She is a Boston attorney who has served as legal counsel for the NAACP. Professor Galbraith, and you may remain seated if you like, would you please begin?
Well, out of respect for you, I'll remain seated. Otherwise, have a sense of physical inadequacy for the rest. I shall. You have no idea what is involved in confining myself to 5 minutes after many years of teaching at Harvard, where any idea, however fragile, can be extended to 55 minutes. There were two Robert Kennedys. One, an extraordinary, diligent, practical politician, and there was Robert Kennedy, who was to an extraordinary extent a modern idealist, had an extraordinary grasp of the larger political scene as we have seen it emerge in the last 25 years. I had experience with both of those versions of Kennedy. The first involved some very practical issues of politics, not always of stirring beauty. I remember, Paul, one particular episode at the 1960 convention, where I arrived, you'll be happy to know, as a minor official of the Democratic National Committee. Got to the airport, was immediately rushed over to the Biltmore Hotel, equipped with all credentials, and put in charge of the candidates west of the Mississippi and to some extent north of the Missouri. My assistant was Byron White, who was about to make one of his best decisions in the Supreme Court, namely to resign. I said to myself, at last, the Democratic establishment and the candidate have discovered what I had always known, namely that Galbraith, although not ostensibly so regarded, was really an extraordinarily competent politician. This was at last revealed, until Kenny O'Donnell told me, he said, "I suppose you know why we have to have you, Ken." Bobby just told me. And I said, "What was that?" Well, he said, "Hell, we got out here and we found that we didn't have a single person on the staff who wasn't Catholic, Irish, or Jewish. And, and you were the only available prospect. They, only available alternative. But the more important thing, much more important, was, as I say, the Kennedy vision of the present and the future, also with strong political overtones. Anciently, we have thought of the conflict, of the dialectic in American politics, as in European politics, as that between capital and labor, labor in various combinations with agricultural workers, farmers. The two great groups anciently in conflict, anciently struggling for political dominance. That, by the time of Robert Kennedy, was becoming obsolete, as it is entirely obsolete today. And I've always thought that Bob Kennedy was one of the first to grasp that fact and see that the modern dialectic was between the extraordinary number of people who are out of the system, minorities, people unemployed, people in poor service occupations, people otherwise, people in the central cities, people otherwise in poor relationship to the rich society of which we are all members, in combination with a very substantial number of people, fortunately, of more fortunate position, who see a union between the dispossessed and the concerned, as against the unconcerned, and who saw the importance of bringing into the political process those who were dispossessed, those who are sometimes referred to as the underclass. And to see that, as I say, as a union with people of compassion, with people of concern, as a winning majority. That was new. And it is for that reason that more than any other that I think tonight we remember Robert Kennedy. I hope that these years since, and I believe these years since, have been in descent from that attitude which he saw as not only central to the prospects of the great republic, but saw in an extraordinarily important human terms as the way in which this could be, the American dream could be part of the life of all Americans rather than just a fortunate minority that has replaced in the dialectic the people that once manned and owned the factories. As I say, this is in my life originated with the campaigns of Robert Kennedy, and I think that today those campaigns are still relevant for the present and for the future. Let me inquire as to whether I've used up my full 5 minutes. If I haven't, why, I will save the remaining minutes and answer any questions later at extraordinary length.
Well, among the other reasons, it's an honor to be here tonight. This is the first time I've been on the same side of the lectern as Ken Galbraith. Usually I'm on the other side taking notes, so it's an honor to be here. And I want to thank Kerry and Michael and others for not only conceiving the idea of this remembrance, but for asking me to play a role in it. It's, for those of us who still believe we're young, it's hard for me to comprehend that the graduates of the Kennedy School this year were not even born when Robert Kennedy announced his candidacy 25 years ago today. 25 years ago tonight, I was the Toastmaster of a St. Patrick's Day dinner in Boston, a group called the Charitable Irish Society, about which James Michael Curley used to say, they're neither charitable nor Irish.
And he was right.
And he was right. And one of the guest speakers that night was Senator Edward Kennedy, who had just returned from the parade in South Boston. His brother Robert had marched with him after having announced his candidacy in Washington, D.C., flown to New York, where he was the United States Senator, marched in the St. Patrick's Day Parade, came to Boston, marched in the South Boston Parade, flew back to Washington, D.C., and as was reported the next day, he landed on a commercial airlines, got off the airlines at Washington National Airport. There was a group of press with him, following him on this all-important mission, and he got off the plane, walked into National Airport. There was not a soul there. Not even his driver. He's looking around, and he turned to the press and he said, "I've got your headline for tomorrow. The hero returned to a tumultuous welcome. The throngs greeted him, and even the police couldn't keep them back." He was a man who combined not only the seriousness of his purpose, but had a tremendous wit that went through all of his, was really a part of his element and his character. And I don't know how to quite, there's nothing you can say that is more powerful than the film that you've seen, but to try to tell you that, or to say that Robert Kennedy had an intensity and a sense of honor about politics is like saying that Larry Bird brought a special work ethic to basketball. They're true, but they have nothing to do with the depth and the real meaning of what it was all about. And Ken Galbraith, I think accurately, talked about whatever people think about the two versions of Robert Kennedy. I believe there was a private Robert Kennedy who believed fiercely in the value of politics, saw it as a means to an end, a mission to do the most good for the most amount of people. The value of politics because he pursued and practiced the politics of values. And that all came, you cannot talk about Robert Kennedy, I don't believe, without talking about President Kennedy. When I was at college here and had just graduated, there is no doubt that I believe the high tide or high water mark of this nation's spirit was during the Kennedy administration. Central to its achievement was a fellow who back here in this state in 1952 managed Senator Kennedy's campaign against Henry Cabot Lodge. And he was asked, you know, well, what about these people say they don't like you? And Bobby Kennedy said, let's get it straight. I don't care what they think about me. What I care about is what they think about Jack. He had a single focus and a single purpose to move his brother's candidacy. That legend, quote unquote, false sort of label that was applied to him as being ruthless was what it was, and in my belief, it was that kind of tenacity, the kind of tenacity when he was Senate counsel of the Labor Rackets Committee, pursued relentlessly Jimmy Hoffa and corruption in the, and then in the Teamsters Union. Then you saw on this film tonight a man who talked unashamedly about love and justice and reconciliation and compassion. There were two sides, it was the same guy. It was the same belief in politics, the values never changed. The other thing about Robert Kennedy and his brother, and I think this is important, more important perhaps as we talk about the future, it's the sense of hope. When I was in my third year at law school here, I couldn't wait to graduate, to respond to that patriotic call about what are you going to do for your country. Couldn't wait. By the time I graduated, President Kennedy was gone. And I'll tell you this, to you kids who think, well, I've been disappointed and hopes are dashed and whatever, you had to live through it to understand what it meant to feel this surge, and then all of a sudden, promises, the unbounded promise that the Kennedy administration set forth for this country was gone. And if I think how I felt, here I was this guy, happened to be Irish, happened to be a Democrat, happened to be Catholic, happened to go to Harvard, happened to love the Cape. And I thought, if I don't have an affinity for this, and then I used to think to myself, what about his family? What about his brother? What about his brother? You talk about hopes dashed and unfulfilled. And then trying to figure out, what does he do to complete this mission? He's Attorney General of the United States under an administration that's not happy with him and vice versa. The country is torn apart by war. There's turmoil and distrust, the like of which we haven't seen since. And frankly, for a long time before that, we hadn't seen it. He talked, I guess, about or thought about teaching. Might have been someday, would have taught at the Kennedy School. Would have been a good thing, but no. The value of politics and not giving up hope and continuing on the mission. So you saw the film of this campaign. And Ken Galbraith mentioned Kenny O'Donnell. He had run for governor. Came back, he was John Kennedy's chief of staff, ran for governor. That's how I got involved. Got involved in his campaign. He lost. The night after the St. Patrick's Day dinner, Kenny called me, that I referred to, Kenny called me, said, "You want to come to Washington?" Bobby Kennedy announced yesterday, "Do I want to come to Washington? I'll be there before you are." Here we go again. This was it, the fulfillment. And the full flowering of Robert Kennedy was in that campaign, I believe. You had all this tension, all this division. And you talk about appealing to the best, the most honorable, the most noble instincts that exist in the American people, while others were playing to fear and reprisal and threat. That's the message about politics and the politics of values. He talked about reconciliation and justice and love and peace, and that we're all in this together. And that we do it not because it's just the smart thing to do, it's the right thing to do. That we need each other. Didn't make any difference about age or color or whatever. And that's the beauty of this country. And so I'd say to those who weren't here to feel it, that film and those of us who were a part of it and cherish it forever, I think about today. And we've seen since Robert Kennedy's death a distaste for government and action and involvement. But there was a young fella out there in Arkansas who remembered John Kennedy and came to politics because of Robert Kennedy, and it is no accident that he talks about a season of service and challenges us to do better and challenges us because we're all in it together. And that is a timeless message that was epitomized by the fellow whose memory we honor tonight. That and the sense of never giving up hope. And if you challenge the best instincts of people and get involved in politics and use it as a way to practice, as he did, the politics of true values, you'll have done a lot for his memory. And that, when he looked around here tonight, Dick, and he sees these young people, he'd love that, I can tell you. There's a lot of things in society he'd still say are unacceptable, but the one thing he's encouraged is the kids who are here tonight, and I hope you all get involved and live up to his memory.
Very good. Very good. I want to stand up because I'm almost as tall standing up as Ken Galbraith is sitting down, and it's a matter of vanity. It was not like most presidential campaigns where the terminally careful candidate strives not to make waves, mistakes, or powerful enemies. It was a different campaign, one where the presidential candidate would regularly and severely scold his audiences for their selfishness. For the candidate, it was not enough merely to comfort the afflicted who loved him. He deliberately chose to afflict the comfortable as well. 25 St. Patrick's Days ago, Robert Kennedy, after hesitating undoubtedly too long, announced his run for the presidency. Much has changed in our country and in our world since then. But the legacy of Robert Kennedy is timeless. That rare candidate who has the guts to tell an audience what the candidate obviously believes and what the audience obviously does not want to hear, can succeed politically, and more important, can move a people. Since Robert Kennedy, in the insightful words of the conservative thinker Jeffrey Bell, no liberal leader has come close to uniting blacks and northern working class whites. Never was that special appeal of Robert Kennedy more apparent than on May 6, 1968, in Gary, Indiana, where in an open convertible with one side of him Tony Zale, the former middleweight champion of the world, the hometown hero to the Eastern European Americans of Gary, and on the other side, Dick Hatcher, the first black mayor of that city. During the last quarter century of clear Republican dominance of our politics, the Republican Party has been the party of big shoulders, of quick fists, of more combative foreign policy, of bigger defense budgets, while the Democratic Party, during that same time, have been the nurturing, more compassionate, more traditionally maternal party, especially good with children, the sick, and the elderly. Uniquely among American politicians, Robert Kennedy was both authentic warrior and genuine nurturer. Tough and combative, called ruthless by his elitist critics, both in and out of the press, Robert Kennedy relentlessly preached a political gospel of compassion. His backbone was rock hard. His heart did bleed for all those who lived on the margin and in the shadows. Earlier in Indianapolis, Robert Kennedy had encountered the sharpest heckling of his Indiana campaign at the Indiana University Medical School. He was booed and hissed as his observations on Social Security, segregation, the draft, and the relationship of government and medicine drew strong opposition from many in his audience. One medical student demanded of Robert Kennedy, "Where are you going to get the money for all those federally subsidized programs you are talking about?" In reply, conspicuous for its concise candor, Robert Kennedy made his campaign managers wince. "From you," he answered. There was none of the old reliable politicians' talk about waste, fraud, and abuse or closing loopholes. Kennedy simply and straightforwardly spoke the allegedly unpalatable truth. He afflicted the comfortable. Only 3 weeks later, at Creighton University in Omaha, just 2 days before the Nebraska primary on May 14th, Robert Kennedy asked how many of his mostly college audience favored deferring students from the draft then in effect. The majority of the hands went up. Robert Kennedy made no effort to conceal his indignation. "Look around you. How many black faces do you see here? How many American Indians? How many Mexican Americans? If you look at any regiment or division of paratroopers in Vietnam, 45% of them are black. You're the most exclusive minority in the world. Are you just going to sit on your duffs and do nothing, or just carry signs in protest?" In Indianapolis and in Omaha, Robert Kennedy told all of us he knew he could not get everyone's vote, that he was willing to write off some constituencies. In Gary, Robert Kennedy offered a democratic populist vision that embraced and appealed to both American blacks and American working class whites. RFK's populism argued that just as schools test students, communities ought to be able to test their schools, that the federal welfare program was destructive and hurtful to the poor, and that because he believed in a government that was effective and energetic, decentralization of power away from Washington must be achieved. That was liberal heresy in 1968. Full disclosure and the conflict of interest fever required that I reveal that I worked for Robert Kennedy in that 1968 campaign. Robert Kennedy was not my friend. He was my hero. I worked for him in Nebraska first, where under the leadership of Lieutenant Governor Phil Sorensen, Democratic Lieutenant Governor, a man with one of the great wits in American politics, who when asked what his plans were for the future said, "I have no plans beyond my present stepping stone." The thing I remember most about Robert Kennedy is that he was not and never was value-free. He believed in values, he practiced values, and to me, his legacy of politics is that politics is nothing less than the peaceable resolution of conflict among legitimate competing interests. I don't know how else, other than politics, in this brawling, diverse, wonderful nation of ours, people from 100 different places speaking 100 different languages, how we're going to reach a national consensus except through politics. I pray that it'll never be through simply muscle or numbers or brawn or bullets. And I think politics is, as it was then, the only answer. His special constituency were those Americans, black and white, who rely on the public life of America. The 93% of American high school students who go to public high schools, the 4 out of 5 Americans who go to colleges and universities who go to public colleges and universities, people who go to public playgrounds for their recreation, who rely on public safety for their personal security. That was politics to Robert Kennedy, and it remains so today. People who ride public transportation to school and to work. The final analysis, I think, every one of us in this room, in this great national community to which we are so privileged to belong, has been warmed by fires we did not build. Every one of us has drunk from wells we did not dig. We can do no less for those who come after us. And for Robert Kennedy's sake, we have to do much more. Thank you.
After the Guggenheim film, Mark Shields leaned over to me and he whispered that after such a powerful piece, that's a hard act to follow. Given everything that's been said in addition to the film, I almost feel like pronouncing a benediction and having us all go home. But I do want to strike very quickly, because I promised that I'd give my state senator a couple of my 5 minutes. I do want to strike a chord with 3 notes, and just kind of listening to you all talk retrospectively about 1968, it struck me that in 1968 I was a sophomore in college and was the president of a black student union. It was very, very militant, and it was against the backdrop of the assassination of folks like Medgar Evers and Martin King and John Kennedy. While we had a vision for a better America, in 1968 as a sophomore in college, I didn't know I'd live to be 43 years old, because we got an opportunity up close to see the worst of what political leadership could bring. Bobby Kennedy, and this is the second note, represented the best of what political leadership has to offer. And looking at the film, a note that you struck, Mark, I was just struck by the contrast, the soul, the depth. Here was a guy that did not provide leadership by press conference, didn't offer us policy by polls, but he was willing to risk it all in order to change it all. And that kind of authentic political leadership is so desperately needed in this country today. The third note that I'd strike, and this is to underscore and pull out some of those values that I think Bobby Kennedy represented that are required in the political context of today. He challenged us to embrace fully this notion of community. As a preacher, we talk about that as the koinonia, the beloved community, the positive opposite of that parable of Jesus that a house divided against itself cannot stand. We need to be about pulling folk together in this country across color, class, community, gender, and generation lines. Carrie mentioned it in her opening remarks. this country sits with bated breath, waiting the outcome of the trial in Los Angeles. And we all need to be concerned that if the officers are found guilty, that there will be those who will be quick to say that the system works and all is well in America. We cannot afford that. On the other hand, if, God forbid, we get a similar verdict as we got the last time, there must be some who have the authenticity and credibility to stand forth and call us again to hope and to the possibilities that exist in this country if we come together. The second value that I think was personified in Bobby Kennedy, the second and third, this is called equality and opportunity. When we look at this country, and this is the other side, the flip side, the quantifiable side of the issue that we're struggling with in LA, we look at the fact that minorities and women are still unemployed at almost twice the general rate. And when we are employed, we earn a little bit more than half as much. When you look at the fact that the average white family in America is worth about $43,000 and the average African-American family is worth about $4,100, we've got a problem in America. When you look at the fact that in Atlanta, Georgia, the mecca of black middle classdom, a city with 7 historically black colleges with over 100-year-old histories, that has had a succession of black mayors that would be the envy of any city, that in Atlanta, Georgia, with more black millionaires than any other city in the country, in Atlanta, Georgia, a white high school dropout has a 60% better chance of getting a home mortgage than a black professional with a graduate degree. We've got a problem with equality and opportunity in this country. We need to embrace the values of Bobby Kennedy and let those values inform our vision for a redeemed America.
Last but not least, I am quickly losing my voice, but I'm determined to get through this tonight because this has really been exciting. It's so rare that I, as an elected official, are asked to talk about politics and am expected to say something that's positive about it. But it's something that I feel very good about, and I'm going to work through this quickly because I'm anxious to get to the questions. But I'm going to start with 1992 and then work backwards because in 1992, I sent I only have 2, but my 2 children, 2 sons, off to college. And they are both freshmen in North Carolina at a historically black college. And I gave them 4 things to do when they got to North Carolina. The first was that they had to find a church.
Amen.
I knew he'd like that. The second was that they had to find the local chapter of the NAACP and become a member, an active member. The third was that I wanted them to be able to tell me when I saw them after they went off in August, when I saw them next, which was Christmas, who the elected city council person, mayor, congressperson for the district in which their school was located, and who the governor of the state. And there's a reason for that. And the fourth thing that I told them was to keep a condom in their wallet. But if they were here, they would be blushing, but that's true. Such things change, and that's the reality of the day. But I want to talk about the piece about the politics, and because that's something that is very, very relevant for where we are tonight. I believe that politics, and particularly in a city like Boston, in which I live, and the one, my district, 2nd Suffolk District, is located, that politics impacts and affects every single aspect of our waking and sleeping life. you understand that, you accept that, and you are able to deal with that in a whole number of ways in which it is necessary to live and survive. I am a state senator, as has been said, and I'm proud to say that I am a state senator for the senatorial district in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that is the most diverse senatorial district in the entire state. And there's a reason why I wanted to be the state senator for this particular district, and it had all to do with its diversity, because I believe that my senatorial district and the population that I represent really does reflect what this city is all about, what the Commonwealth is all about, and what this country is supposed to be about. And that is one in which it is possible to deal with a whole diverse array of people who come to a place very different, and to agree on a common goal, even in our differences. We used to talk about this country as a melting pot, and somewhere along the way, we got wise, and we now talk about this place as a mosaic in which everybody can be part of this big picture, that you don't have to be me, I don't have to be you. We can all be who we are individually and all work towards these common goals. And I think that to be able to do that and to talk to people during the campaign process, which was an experience that I think you only get to do your first one once, and it's one I will never forget. But the beauty of it was its diversity. And the other beauty was, for me, making a decision when I started this process that I was going to tell everybody the same thing, that I wasn't going to have a story that I told when I spoke to black people, that I wasn't going to have a story that I told when I spoke to Latinos. I didn't have a gay and lesbian story, and I didn't have a story that I spoke when I spoke to white people. I had a story about the diversity and about the fact that we were all here, that the likelihood of all of us going in different places was not very real, that it was absolutely critical that we had to figure out a way that we could coexist in a manner that allowed people to be their individual selves and at the same time contribute to this greater good. I believe that, and I really do believe that that's possible. And part of the amazement, I think, and the shock of so many people about what happened in that race, again, is all about what we are talking about tonight. And that is that I have 58 precincts in that district. We have the largest population of gay and lesbian voters in the Commonwealth. We have the largest concentration of African Americans in any senatorial district. We have a very large population of white voters in the district. We have a substantial population. In fact, 70% of the 60% African American population are single women heads of households, which I am one. And so when you think about all that diversity and the possibility and the opportunity to be able to talk to people about public service and about politics and what it's all about, and to be able to say to you that I was able to convince enough people that of the 58 precincts in that district, that I won every one of the 58 precincts. The reason why that is significant is specifically because of the diversity, and no one thought it was going to happen, because it's not something that's ever happened before in a city like Boston, which seems to thrive historically on the divisions. And what I find when I talk to people is that they're not happy with it. They don't like it. What they want is to figure out a way for us to talk about what we can do as a people. And so that's my 1992-93 story, and then I want to go back. I was not in college in 1968, but I remember all of the things that happened in '68, and I particularly remember watching TV during some of what I consider to be some of the darkest days in the history of our country, and thinking as I watched, and particularly after watching what happened to Robert Kennedy, wondering why on earth anybody would want to be an elected official, that it cannot be worth this. And then, so I sit here today as a senator from the 2nd Suffolk District representing the city of Boston. But part of it is the evolution and that I went through, and the realization that came to me that politics does have such a total and absolute impact on our lives and how we live it. I am also, I think if politicians are one of the least respected professions, lawyers are probably on the second on the list. And so I happen to be one of both. I was a lawyer first and practiced in fact, developed a practice, for the most part, representing people who had been disenchanted and disconnected with our system, if you believe they were ever connected to begin with. But one of the things that happened to me was getting drawn in, and I was a litigator, and I did civil litigation. It was as boring as anything that I could ever think of. But I was asked one day to come and be a part of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and the significance, for those of you who don't know, President Kennedy actually called this whole army of lawyers to the White House in the early 60s and asked lawyers to do what he believed to be then public service. And the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights was born. In fact, Robert Kennedy had an enormous amount of responsibility in pulling together this group of lawyers and starting this organization. The first committee chapter was in Boston. I became a member of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and it was through that involvement that I began to think how really crazy this is what we do. We have a city, and I think a country. People talk about Boston being a racist city. I think that the reality is that we happen to be more litigious in Boston than probably anywhere else. We fight our issues out. We debate them. And we are not afraid to talk about the things that we know are wrong. And it was that belief that got me involved in cases around housing and landlord-tenant issues, and most recently something that Reverend Stith mentioned, that we have been dealing with the last 2.5 to 3 years with what has come to be known as the second mortgage scam. And one of the things that I came to and wrestled with was this notion that law plays a very important part in our lives, but that ought not be the way we expect people to get what are basic and fundamental human rights accorded to them on a day-to-day basis. And put it in some context, we live in a city where in order to get black teachers in any respectable numbers, we had to sue the school department. We have black firefighters because we sued the fire department. We have black policemen because we had to sue the police department. Whatever semblance of fairness we have in our public housing, it's because we sued our housing authority and also the federal government, the Federal Department of Housing and Human and Urban Development. And it occurred to me that we cannot afford to spend 10 and 15 years in human capital waiting for someone on high to decide that black children have a right to equal education, that people have a right to live where they want, because we are losing generations of people in the meantime. And I really believe that a profession, and I think of it as a very noble profession, and I would be prepared to defend that to anyone who questioned it, but that the profession of elected politicians is a noble one, that it is a public service of the highest calling. It is the ultimate sacrifice that one can make, because you not only make a decision to, for the most part, live in as close to poverty, I think, as my mother probably would have imagined that I would be, considering that all the time that I spent going to law school. Because we pay, for example, our state senators in Massachusetts are paid $30,000, and it's a full-time job. If I never believed that, I understand that now very clearly. It's a full-time job. And it's a sacrifice. You not only sacrifice that piece of it, but you also sacrifice your whole life. And it is my belief that if you're going to put your life on the table for everyone to dissect and pick it apart, that you at the very least have a right to expect that people acknowledge and respect that the service that we give. That's not there. And I think that it was. I think we lost it. And I think we were very close on the verge of getting it back. And I think that there's something clearly that happened, and that President Clinton, certainly talking about the nostalgia and the memory and the reminiscing about the Kennedy era, I think forced a lot of people to rethink this whole issue of what we think about elected officials and what we think about government service, that it is in fact a noble profession. And I feel individually and singularly honored to have been chosen by the people in my district to serve as their state senator. And I'm also of the belief that part of the reason why people feel the way that they do about elected officials and about politics as a service is because what we've not figured out how to do historically is how to hold people accountable. And I think that that's really the formula that people figured out in 1992. You do your job, you stay. You don't do your job, you leave. It's very basic. It makes sense to me. And I would hope that people would hold me to that standard, because if they allowed me to stay when I wasn't doing it, by staying, you really do help diminish the reputation and the credibility that I think that we must have as politicians in order to do the business that we do. Leadership is everything. It is absolutely a critical part of what being a state senator or any public service and elected office means, because we think about it in terms of what we do in the State House, but there's a totally different aspect to it, and that is an expectation that we lead, and that people have to be brave enough to stand up and say that and talk about things out loud. Like to say, I'm a liberal. I don't feel like I need to whisper that. I don't call it the L word. I will use all three of those syllables. I am a liberal. You know, I am a Democrat, and I mean a Democrat in the true sense of the word, because I think that part of what we do every day is have to remind our colleagues what it means to be a Democrat, and really a true Democrat in the Kennedy era. Interpretation of that means that you have to believe that all people are created equal, that if you have to be strong and have the courage, that's a word that we keep hearing because it's important, because that means courage to say what you know is right. Because if people expect for it to be comfortable, then it's not going to be real. It's going to be uncomfortable. And that's part of what I'm hearing in the message about how and what Robert Kennedy talked about. It made people uncomfortable. If they weren't uncomfortable, then he would not have been telling us the truth about what we need to hear about ourselves. And I want to talk one last thing about young people, because I think that in the shame and the crime of the miseducation that we have done, and not teaching all of this country's young people about their individual contributions to the society and what the value and the beginning and the purpose of what and how we all fit in this picture. We have created a whole society of people who do not believe that they came from anything. And if you don't believe you came from anything, you can't even imagine that there's somewhere for you to go. It was a disservice that we did to people that we're paying for. It didn't happen by accident. That is part of what we have to get back, because it also is the legacy of young people to lead. They were absolutely critical in the civil rights movement. They were critical in JFK's election. They got out there and they worked and they voted. And we're talking about college students. In the civil rights movement, we're talking about high school students. Those were the people who were sitting down. We don't tell them that. So when they think about what they can do, they haven't really been thinking about themselves as critical pieces in our history. Both of my sons this November cast their first ballot for the presidency of the United States, and I'll tell you, it was an exciting time for them. I have never seen so many young people and been so happy to see so many young people excited about politics and excited about an election. It had to be the most educated, politically educated group of young people that I've ever seen. And I mean, even in elementary school, we've got to find a way to keep that and to make that and make sure that what happened, and people understand that what happened in 1992 was not a fluke, but really the beginning of a rebirth of a new country, one that's going to live up to its mission, to its legacy, and that is to take care of all of the people and to provide the kind of fairness and open opportunities, public service. I'm so proud that our own city year program is being used as the president as a model for his national service program, because we think that we do some things, we do them very well here, and that's one of them. So I'm looking forward to continuing to serve in political office, but I consider it a noble profession, and one that I have been blessed with the opportunity to serve. And certainly in that era, I look forward to the future and what that's going to mean for us, because I think that we've started something real here, and I just hope, and we depend on young people an awful lot to make sure that this continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you all of our members of the panel. Speaking of young people, let me quickly introduce some members of the RFK Action Corps and the John F. Kennedy Library Corps who are here with us tonight. Would you stand and let us recognize you? We're prepared now for a few questions. We can't go on very much longer because the building needs to close here soon. But we'll start with you, sir.
Thank you. Many of you have spoken very eloquently tonight about how Robert Kennedy was an inspiration for your serving and deciding to serve in public life. And I think it's fair to say that a great many of today's generation of leaders cite the Kennedys as their source of inspiration. My question is in two parts. As many of you know, politics for certainly today's generation is an unattractive profession, one that tends to not inspire a desire to go into that. I wish that each of you could evaluate the current administration's proposal on national service as a means to regenerate that spirit. And secondly, in terms of the institution of the Kennedy School, by furthering that debate on national service, do you see that as a means to perhaps reconcile the mission of the school with the vision of Robert Kennedy?
Would somebody like to take that on? I don't think we all need to answer it.
If you want to try it?
You take it on.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, fellas. Appreciate that.
What's a moderator for, right?
We had a discussion at an earlier supper tonight with the founders and directors of City Year, who talked about a variety of kinds of national service blossoming and taking shape around the country, and not perhaps the centralized, big central plant, Peace Corps, CCC kind of a nationally operated program, but something more entrepreneurial, something that would fit a more decentralized model of government and public participation. And lots of things are going on in that area around the university and the school. And I think the operation like City Year, which is now spending much of its time talking to other cities and representatives of other cities about this program and seeing it replicated around the country, is one of those organizations that's helping to spread that kind of activity.
Do you see, though, the current time, if you will, as being ripe for a regeneration of this sense of public service, as opposed to simply being a nostalgic glance back at a time that no longer exists?
Well, I'm kind of one of those nostalgic glancers. You're one of those young people who might be in a better position to answer that question than any of us. What's your view on that?
I think I've taken up too much time already, but I do believe that this is an opportunity, and with the Clinton administration in office, we're very excited here at the Kennedy School to try and further that debate and foster that kind of public spiritedness.
Good for you. Thanks.
I'd just add one other thing, if I may. I think the difference, for instance, the way President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy understood their platform for leadership, each of them called out to the country. While they cared about and worked tirelessly for rights, they cared about responsibilities and understood, I think, that they as individuals couldn't do it all, but if the country understood the problem and was challenged to go to work on it, that we'd all be better off for it. I believe myself that that's sort of one of the things that Bill Clinton inherited from John and Robert Kennedy, and that he'll use the White House to that effect, and I think we'll all be better for that.
I just add one thing, if I could, and that is, I think the point you make is a good one. I think for 12 years in Washington, we have had what can only be described as a soap opera. And the soap opera has consisted of a conservative president submitting an unbalanced budget to a mostly liberal Congress, which reproached this conservative president for submitting this unbalanced budget and then passed it. And then they, in turn, were approached by the president for having passed the budget he submitted. And it was a wonderful little play. Each side had its part. And there was a premium on pointing out the failures of government. Over the past 20 years, American confidence in the federal government has declined from 3 out of 4 Americans having great deal or some confidence in the federal government down to 2 out of 5. And I think that's a legacy of divided government. I think the one line of Bill Clinton's that I've heard echoed over and over again in the speech he gave to the joint session of Congress was, I accept responsibility. I think Americans are dying for leadership that accepts responsibility. I think that's part of politics. And I think there's a chance, and I give Ronald Reagan credit as well in 1980 for at least discussing and debating ideas again. Because when there isn't a consensus in the country, then it's a lot easier for me to fault my political opponent for double parking outside an orphanage on Christmas Eve or ripping the tag off the mattress in violation of federal law or something of the sort. So, I mean, once you decide that maybe government should be about important things, then they're going to have a real discussion, a real debate, and real differences, rather than just kind of the baloney we've been living through.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to address this very, to me, troublesome question to the three lawyers in the audience, Kerry Kennedy, Diane Wilkerson, and look, congratulations, and my old buddy Paul Kirk, who was in the same private school reformatory with me at a very young age. We survived, but barely. The question is this. I've taught constitutional law to many Harvard undergraduates and seen many with a heavy public service civil rights orientation, and also have seen many of those undergraduates go to law school and go into things like legal services for the poor or work for the Department of Public Welfare as a lawyer for 7 or 8 years, and then come to me in enormous distress because the funding goes, and they find when they go looking for a long-term career job, and look, their counterparts are starting out now in New York at $85,000. One, no small firm will take them because they don't have portable billings. No law firm wants them because they haven't experience in securities. You can't practice law on their own, and their wife's threatening divorce, and they're drinking too much. And there is no long-range partnership track in public service.
Before we're so depressed we can't go on, would you mind just asking your question, Mo?
That's the question.
All
What
right.
do you say to those people about a long-range career in public service?
Thank you.
What do you say to them?
Go ahead, long-term career. Go ahead, long-term career.
Well, first of all, I come back to the point of the importance of what those young people have set out to do. But I put an enormous amount of currency in the leadership of the country setting a tone about the importance of that and the encouragement of it. And we were talking earlier as well about the ripples that Robert Kennedy talked about. And those things can ripple through the private sector as well if you have the right kind of tone of leadership. And so I would say to those folks, for the first, not to despair and to give up hope. It's an important avenue they're pursuing. And then I, again, put a lot of faith in the educational system and then the leadership from the top to encourage and inspire and to let those people know that there may not be a lot of currency income in the first few years, but there's a lot of reward and satisfaction of doing that kind of work in the country.
Let me just add one other note. Though he asked for the lawyers, I'm going to speak as an authority on the law. The capital L. One of the things that even after the 15 years in the ministry that still amazes me is that people are motivated by things other than money, and that get excited about helping people, get excited about working for people. And I'd add that there isn't necessarily a contradiction between working, doing civil law or doing torts, and then finding some space in your life to volunteer time in other venues. I mean, I'm sure there's a role for folk who work 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 in a law firm downtown and to do work at City Year. So I don't think that the only venue for service is to pursue a career of public advocacy. But one of the things that makes, when this country operates at its best is that people find space to give of themselves in addition to everything else they need to do to make their lives work.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to say I'd like to first of all reinforce, I think one of the reasons why some people are here, many people are here, is Robert Kennedy affected the lives of many people that he didn't come in contact with. I remember I was in elementary school living on Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My father was a lieutenant colonel. And they had the riots in Washington, D.C., and they were assigned to go up and patrol the streets of Washington, D.C. And he met Robert Kennedy. And I had never heard him speak of politics or politicians my whole life. And he was really inspired by seeing Robert Kennedy out on the streets meeting people. So I just wanted to just bring that up and let people know that inspired me through my father. What he did was probably not too many politicians were doing it. I'm going to direct my question. I don't want to throw it out for posterity. It might not be answered, but I'd like to direct it to Mark Shields. And I keyed on something that you said during your remarks when you said Robert Kennedy was about putting together and bringing together legitimate forces peacefully and having them dialogue. And you've just restated that putting something on the table and making it debatable is really what we need. And probably, my wife told me not to ask a question here tonight, but I just had to. I watched the McLaughlin group this week. And I watched Gergen and Shields too. But I mean, I think it all, you know, I mean, in one perspective, it's all the same. Because what you're getting is a white, male, same bracket type point of view. And I'm not saying that you can't share that view, but I'm saying when you have a different perspective, an indigenous perspective of a debated issue, that you are going to be able to change attitudes in America on a legitimate basis. And that legitimacy has to be given not only by your words, but by the words of many qualified people such as Charles Dye and many, many others, to have that opportunity to speak and to make that change. And that's what puts it on the table. And I am just probably tired of seeing that, of hearing that, and of facing that. We have to work together. So let's put everybody in, talking about it and debating the issues in truly a genuine and honest manner. Could you respond?
Thank you. I'm not sure how you want me to respond. I mean, I can't argue with anything you said.
I would like for you to
I'm not going to defend John McLaughlin.
No,
that isn't what I mean. I got a lot of things in life I'd like to do, but defending John McLaughlin is not one of them.
I want you maybe to verify if that's a legitimate concern, if you recognize it as a need, and is there anything that you could do or what could be done with the press? Because I think that you have almost as great as influence as the politicians you speak of.
I think the institutional press has an awful lot to answer for. There's no question about it. As far as hearing from different and diverse voices. I think major newspapers have continued to make major efforts and are signally more successful than they were 20 years ago. 25 years ago. There wasn't a single black on the press bus covering Robert Kennedy in 1968 or covering the Hubert Humphrey campaign. And I think the women consisted of Mary McGrory and probably Mary Ann Means, and that was it. So it has changed. It is changing. Could it be better? The only objection I have or reservation is when you mention McLaughlin. I think the Jesuits, whom I have enormous respect, have a lot to answer for. When in one year they gave us John McLaughlin, Pat Buchanan, and Jerry Brown. I mean, that's probably 3 strikes and you're out. But go ahead, Senator.
Jerry Brown was all right.
Jerry Brown was okay, but he was a little strange.
Bobby Kennedy's vision than Bill Clinton.
Okay, let's let the questioner answer.
I'll talk to you later.
Senator.
Yeah, I had a comment about that because, you know, one of the things we talked about is the fact that I was the first black female. The other thing I didn't say is the only black in the Senate. We have 40 people in our Senate, and I'm the only one. And one of the realities I talk to young people about is about the isolation, about the responsibility for the issues to be more than my issues. And I even had the discussion with my colleagues that just because I'm here doesn't mean that I'm the person who's supposed to talk about black stuff. That, and I want you to know that early, because I'm not going to do this for 2 years, because in another month you're going to be seeing here she comes again. But as Democrats, there are 31 of us, that should be an issue for all of us. And one of the things that was very important, we talked all of this stuff about this being the year of the woman. I think when you get to the point where you represent over 50% of the population, that you have a viewpoint that ought to be heard. And that's why it's important. Not that I believe women have all the right answers or that African Americans have all the right answers, but we have an answer. And that discussion has got to be part of the policy-making discussion, which is why I moved from litigating laws that other people set to a position where I could be involved in the discussion about establishing them in the first place. But one person can make a difference, but I don't want to be there for a long time and be the only one. Pioneering is a trip. And I think but that's something we all have to think about, that, because people would be very happy to rest on those laurels and say she's there now and we've arrived, but it doesn't work like that. And it's incumbent upon us to own this as our collective issue.
We're really running out of time. And I want to get just these last two questions here. Last two questions, then we've got to close it off. Yes?
My name's Susan Baker. I'm a member of a group here called the Kennedy School Project on National Service. It's a group of students who have gotten together at the inspiration of Clinton's call to renew the commitment to public service that I think the Kennedys began. Not began, but fostered. Our group is not just worried about national policy. That's definitely a concern of ours. But we're also worried about thinking about how we at the Kennedy School can best prepare people to answer the call to national service and to join politics and make it become an honorable profession. My question is directed not just to those within the Harvard community, but also to you who are from Washington and elected officials. What do you think schools like the Kennedy School should be doing to promote public service and to encourage people that this is a noble profession? It's more than curriculum, I think. We're really looking for concrete ways that we can make a difference and improve this in young people's lives.
I'd just like to pick up on a point that my senator raised a moment ago, and it was implicit in the question that was raised relative to the different voices that need to be heard as a part of the discussion around how policy is crafted. You really do need to explore every opportunity to get from this side of the Charles to the other side into communities where people are hurting, and they have something to say about their pain. It's interesting, I can't remember who I was in conversation with, but it was an academic who made the point that we often drag our old models because it's interesting how quickly we forget the stuff that doesn't work. Well, that might be true in a community like this, but in a community like that in which I live, the folk don't forget. Therein lies the root of the hopelessness and the cynicism. The suspicion of job training programs that lead to no jobs. It's important, and this is the beauty of this film. A politician who wasn't afraid to touch the people. You've got to get out of the cocoon, and it's important to have time for reflection, but you've got to make time for interaction.
So what you would say for our group is that we should be focusing on reaching out to the community and evaluating the real impacts of those projects?
Listening. Not just evaluating. The important thing is listening. It's interesting. We make, if our doctors attended to our health needs, and there's a lot to be said about healthcare system and the job Hillary is doing, all that aside. But it would be interesting if our doctors practiced medicine like our politicians and policymakers make policy. If you went to the doctor and the doctor told you what was wrong with you when you walked into the door, before you had a chance to say where you hurt, you'd want another doctor. But we think nothing of the fact that politicians and policymakers great statements about the way of the world and the way we fix it, and they only deal with people in cold, staid statistical terms.
Mr. Galbraith, you wanted to add something?
Well, I think there's a case for also an element of cold statistical response here. There's a certain troublesome factor about this discussion, which has much to do with attitude, much to do with mood, much to do with leadership. Let us remind ourselves that there is nothing that can be done for the disadvantaged in this national community, in this republic. It doesn't cost money. And along with our emphasis on attitude and our emphasis on will, there must also be an emphasis on willingness to pay for it.
Amen.
There is nothing that we can do on behalf of the impoverished of the United States, of those people to whom Robert Kennedy addressed his very best comment. There's nothing that we can do about that which doesn't cost money, which doesn't involve public funds. So let us not forget that we have, beyond the creation of mood, beyond idealism, that terribly important thing of creating a willingness to pay for it. And I somehow feel that has not been sufficiently emphasized tonight. But having emphasized it myself, of course, there's no question that it will be
Yes, sir.
central doctrine for everybody from now on.
Yeah, the last question.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Robert James, and I'm a first-year law student at the Harvard Law School, and I'm one of those people who was born after Senator Kennedy was assassinated. And I think that I'm one of those people who was profoundly affected, even though I was not alive during his lifetime. I have, throughout my lifetime, looked at politics as being an end to be pursued. And of late, I've been thinking, in terms of the issues that I'm interested in, which are empowering African Americans and lifting them out of some of the conditions that make them more than their fair share of what are the so-called underclass, the so-called disadvantaged. I'd like to understand, I'd like to hear comments from the panel on striking a balance between seeking some type of economic empowerment versus putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, as I think that a number of us see that African Americans have done, which is to pursuing politics as the only means, politics and government as the only means of improving our condition. Of late, I've thought that that building economic institutions will give us the luxury, as the Kennedy family had, the luxury, because of their economic condition, they had the luxury to address a number of these issues which they were morally outraged about. Without that economic foundation, I'm not sure how powerful their message would have been, and I'd just like some comments on African Americans building up economic institutions as opposed, not necessarily as opposed to, but also in conjunction with seeking political empowerment.
I just kind of quickly, because maybe some other folks want to get in on this, that in the way you articulated the question, I mean, you've got the answer, that it really is not an either-or agenda, that we need folk who are policy makers, that deal with the social conditions in which we live, but who also can impact on the kind of policies that affect the economy. I mean, one of the pieces that both the Senator and I have devoted a lot of time over the past several years is dealing with is the banks and community reinvestment. Well, banks are independent, private sector institution, a set of institutions, yet how they do business, the franchise to do business, is one that is at the at the public trust. So that's important. We need the private sector initiatives. We need preachers, talking about issues of morals and values, and we need social workers. So it's not an either-or agenda, but we must have the full spectrum folk committed to the revitalization of our community and redemption of the country.
I'd just add, or put it another way, I think it's more than either or. I don't think we can, the good politics of this country looking ahead, we're not going to be able to survive without the empowerment of the diverse elements of this country. Globalization is on us. I mean, it's the only way we're going to be able to do the thing we ought to be able to doing as a competitive country, educating all our people, giving them an opportunity to contribute economically, politically, whatever way it is. It's, I mean,
And you're willing
it's right
to pay
there.
the price for that.
As you said so well, and I'm not going to try and compete with you on that, there is nothing for nothing. People understand it today. I think they've been, you know, we've had this honeymoon for so long. That's just the wake-up call that's right in front of us today. That you're trying to deal with $4 trillion of debt and $350 billion of budget deficits, and people are running for cover and so forth. No running anymore.
Would you join me in thanking our panel and thank all of you, and especially Carrie Kennedy Cuomo for being with us tonight and helping us put this on. Thank you all very much for coming.
25 years.
Skill as ever.
Good to be with you.